Kamala, she said, people say, oh, Kamala, she's vague on policy. She doesn't really shit on policy. And then all of a sudden, she releases a 70-page, 80-page giant policy document, which, it doesn't look like an intern just made this in Microsoft Word, like the RNC platform. If you remember that video we made, it looks like
spelling mistakes, dog.
Yeah,
the
like
RNC one had spelling mistakes.
it had, it has like coloring and pretty graphs, and it's form. It just looks like it was properly formatted. She releases this big policy doc. Micah wanted to talk about it. We're going to talk about it before the audience topic. Micah, let's just start with you. What are some of the things in this policy document? Is there any new big things that we just aren't aware of that she released in this document?
So I want us to focus specifically on taxes just to make this manageable, and maybe we can revisit it later. But I would say that one of the things that we learned about by reading this document was language on occupational licensing reform. For regulatory nerds like us who get really frustrated that people can get a license in one state and not be able to go use that license in another state, or that some people have to get a license for things that are maybe unnecessary to get a license for. It's nice to see that she's actually put some language in there for that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I had a big question for me out of the Kamala campaign was that she had some lip service to expanding the EITC, or like reestablishing the EITC. And that was always confusing. I was like, wait, but the EITC didn't go away under, like, what is she talking about? And what she's talking about is, and this is a good policy, although it's like not optimal policy for a number of reasons. The EITC is kind of weird. For those that don't know, the EITC, it's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Some people akin this to a negative income tax, and it's kind of like it's like if Bill subsidy. Yeah, it's kind of like a negative income tax, but not really. Basically, it has this trapezoid structure, and by that what I mean is essentially you have to earn money to get more EITC. Now this sounds weird. Like why would you have to earn more money to get more EITC? It's because again, Washington welfare politics, they have this idea that we have to encourage people to work. We have to encourage people to work to get welfare. So if we just give everyone welfare, then people won't want to work. And by having you get more subsidy as you work more, up to a certain point, of course, because it also has to be means tested on the back end, we're encouraging people to work. And so you basically earn more, get more EITC, and then it caps out at certain incomes. And then as you earn more and more, you get less and less EITC. So this is the trapezoidal structure. And you get more EITC given the number of children you have. So the trapezoid structure sort of shifts upward the more children that you have, because again, we want to subsidize, basically children's expenses and things like that on top of child tax credit subsidies. What Kamala has proposed, apparently what the American Rescue Plan did, was for people with no children. People with no children get barely any EITC. It's like $500 or something like that at the most. It's very, very little subsidy for people with no children. She has said, let's triple that. Let's make the maximum EITC that you get from not having children but just working $1,500. And again, this is good policy. It's good to give people an extra $1,000 who are very low wage workers, of course. But I think that the biggest thing in her platform certainly is the child tax credit expansion. But guys, thoughts on the EITC expansion? We'll talk about the child tax credit, I assume, next after this. What do you guys think?
I mean, insofar as the EITC is just like a partial step towards a UBI with like a weird trapezoid structure, pretty unambiguously good, right?
Yeah, pretty unambiguously good. But one caveat. Yeah, go on, Micah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say one caveat that I have with regards to the EITC is that, and this is something Brunig, North Star Brunig has pointed out, is that one of the problems with these tax credit subsidies in general is that people, like a lot of people just don't file their taxes, and a lot of people don't know the subsidies that they're qualified for. So you end up having some pretty major portion of people, like 30-40% of people, that just like incorrectly file their taxes, or they don't file their taxes, and so they don't actually get these subsidies, which kind of sucks as well. There's not clearly a mechanism in Kamala's plan to really address that problem. But anyway, Michael, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly structural issues with the EITC. For instance, as we all know, there should be no phase in. That doesn't really dramatically increase the number of people working. And it means the poorest people, the people with zero income, get zero benefit. Also makes administration a little bit more complicated. Of course, it's a cash-based welfare program that goes to low-income people. So that's good. It's administered through the tax code, and it's not a new program. Those are good things. We don't need new programs. We already have way too many programs. This is expanding it to people who don't have kids. That makes sense. Clearly, something that needs to be done, and has been proposed many times, is getting rid of the whole entire child-based structure of the EITC. It's so strange, right? Because we already have a child tax credit. We give people tax breaks for having kids. Why would you also make this different program meant to incentivize work and subsidize working people's wages also have a subsidy for kids?
Well, people have pointed out that this is also very morally dubious, right? Because you're basically saying, well, if you're a poor kid because your parents are disabled, you actually get less subsidy from the government than if you're a poor kid whose parents work, which is pretty insane, obviously, just from like the face of it. But that is the structure of our current welfare system.
Well, I mean, I suppose you could get Social Security, disability insurance, or there might be some extra child benefits that come in here. But it's like our welfare system is a completely Byzantine mess. But like insofar that you're going to increase welfare spending on a current program that exists without modifying its structure that much, this is probably one of the best ones, because so many of our welfare programs are really poorly structured.
Yeah, it's better to expand this than to expand TANF or the food stamp program or anything like that. If we had a based progressive platform, like Micah said, just take that trapezoid structure and make it a not a rhombus, but just get rid of that leg of it and just make it on the zero bound. This brings me to the child tax credit, and this is actually kind of what the child tax credit reform under the American Rescue Plan that Kamala wants to make perfect and expand on. This is kind of what they did. So some conservatives who don't understand anything about policy have said, oh, well, Trump loves the child tax credit. He doubled the child tax credit to $2,000. This is misleading on a couple fronts. Number one, yes, he did raise the maximum child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000. That's true. And he expanded the base of the child tax credit, so he made it less means tested. Basically, I think it was like you had to make like less than $75,000 before the child tax credit started phasing out. He raised it to something pretty high. It was like over $200,000 or something like that. So a lot more people qualified for the child tax credit. However, caveat, the fully refundable portion of the child tax credit under Trump's plan was only increased to $1,400. Now, the reason why this is important is because you can think of fully refundable tax credits as basically a zero bound on the maximum amount that your average person gets from the child tax credit. So what do I mean by that? If a tax credit is not fully refundable, what that means is if you're really, really poor, and let's say that you only made $13,000, like you worked like some part-time job or something like that, you make like $13,000. You simply might not have paid enough taxes to actually qualify for the deduction in your taxes that tax credits actually represent. So let's say that you paid, I don't know, $800 in taxes. If the child tax credit is fully refundable, if the child tax credit is only eligible up to $1,000, you're only going to get $1,800 back. And so similarly, if it's fully refundable up to $1,400, let's say that you paid $1,800 in taxes, you're only going to get $1,400, right? So it ends up cutting off the welfare benefits by making the fully refundable portion much lower. What the Biden administration did, they made that fully refundable portion up to the entire thing, and they expanded the amount to $3,600. So essentially, the effective amount of child tax credit that the poorest people got was increased from $1,400 all the way up to $3,600. So it more than doubled the child tax credit for the poorest Americans. That's why the poverty effects of Biden's tax credit were so much bigger than the poverty effects of Trump's tax credit.
It also paid it forward in monthly installments, which is really important too, just for families to have that liquidity.
Family planning, exactly. Another thing worth mentioning is that Kamala has said we want to reintroduce the $3,600 fully refundable credit, and then also add a newborn tax credit, which is also fully refundable, of $6,000. That's a huge amount of money to give to newborn children. And the reason that you do that, obviously, from like a policy perspective, some countries do this with baby boxes and things like that, basically just give cash or some in-kind benefit to newborn children. It's because obviously when you have a newborn child, there's a lot of fixed expenses that are associated with that. A lot of medical bills, a lot of, you got to buy cribs, baby proofing, your first round of clothes, all these kind of things that you have to buy from the jump when you have a child. And if you're a poor person, the difference between having $0 extra dollars for a newborn baby and $6,000 is a huge difference in the welfare of that child and the welfare of that family. Obviously, this is a cash benefit. You can use it for more things than just like paying directly for baby things. So the welfare effects of these policies is really, really strong. Child poverty under the Biden administration's expanded tax credit was down to like 5%. You'd imagine it would be substantially even lower under this policy, plus the $6,000 tax credit for newborns that Kamala is suggesting. Esty, it looks like you had something to say.
I was just mentioning in one of the notes that she has on this, we often talk about the direct benefits of child poverty reduction. She cites a study, not she, but the intern that put this together says researchers found that expanding the CTC returns as much as $15 to society for every $1 invested in children's health, education, and future earnings. And so part of the point here is that there isn't just these private benefits to increasing welfare, that like children aren't in poverty, their families aren't in poverty. It's also that those will have huge social benefits of reduced crime, increased education, which means greater earnings, greater innovation, like all these things down the line. We're leaving all this money on the table by letting children live in poverty. And so it's just sort of unconscionable that we're not. Even if you're like a fiscal conservative, you should want these kind of investments.
Yeah, exactly. Like one thing that I try to point out to conservatives is that, we talk about equal opportunity, right? We want to have equal opportunity. Well, look, I mean, every child that grows up with parents who don't work or make substantially low incomes, who go to crappy schools, who live in bad environments, who get into bad activities and become criminals or just become like very unproductive members of society. Those are people that had the capacity to become scientists, engineers, thought leaders, like very productive people in our society. And studies back this up. Children that grow up in poverty have lower IQs. Children that grow up in poverty just like necessarily don't live up to their full potential. There have been experimental studies where like temporary welfare programs, and I'm sure there's probably going to be a lot of studies about this with the one-time child tax credit that happened under Biden, but studies have done this where temporary welfare programs where you can compare families that have been affected by these programs and cutoff dates, and what you'll find is that the educational attainment and the end life sort of results of these children that grow up to be adults is way better. They end up earning more money. They have better family lives. They become, they're less likely to be criminals. There's so many social benefits to children just like not living in abject poverty. You take some of those symptoms off by having some of these subsidies. It's very, very good for society to invest in children. It's amongst the most sort of per dollar productive things the government can put money into is just making sure children grow up in equitably financed environments, and that's kind of what this speaks to. Micah, what were you going to say?
I'd say that an example which is similar to this is child labor. It's like, not only is child labor bad to like submit a child to, but it reduces their productivity throughout their entire life by doing damage to their body and their psyche and reducing their ability to get education. So it just seems to be the case that helping out kids is like not only like the morally correct thing to do, but also like just absolutely like the highest return welfare activity that you could pursue.
Absolutely. So we love those policies from Kamala. And unfortunately, we talked about this in the last segment. This really isn't getting a lot of play. Like this would literally cut the amount of children in poverty probably by more than half, by like 67%. We'd have so many less children living in poverty. And it's not just so many less children living in poverty. All those children that remain in that cutoff that we call poverty would still be substantially more, better financially off in that circumstance as well, even though they still fall under this sort of technical definition of poverty. All children would be made substantially better by this policy. All children would be. And so it's very important to keep that in mind as well, even if we assume that the poverty cutoff effects don't exist. But in general, guys, what are some other things in this document? Those are kind of the two main things that stuck out to me. Was there anything else worth note, SDL?
Just before we get too far from the CTC, one thing I wanted to add as well, like I'm talking about these second order effects. We know that a lot of studies with stuff which looks like UBI find that it actually can reduce divorce rates and keep couples together. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up is that like a big factor in people getting divorced is financial stress. If you're extremely poor, you've got a new child, it's an extremely stressful time of your life. One of those stresses is money. Giving people money like empirically reduces both the mental health disorders of children and the likelihood of divorce for the adults. If you are a pro-family conservative, right, or if you think that there's a benefit to keeping families together, these are unironically the kinds of things that you should support that actually seem to have empirical evidence in slightly raising the marriage rate, slightly lowering the divorce rate. So if we're talking about second order effects, look, I just love families. I love them so much. And conservatives, I don't know why they want all these families to break up, right? They want everyone to be stressed with these new kids. They want a bunch of divorces. It's really crazy.
And let's run through very quickly the arguments against the CTC. Number one argument, the money is not used on the kids. People are just going to have kids in order to get the money. If people are having kids in order to get the money, we actually need to increase our birth rate, so that's fine. But that's also not going to happen because having a kid is tremendously net negative, even with the CTC. Who thinks that a child costs $3,600 a year? Please show me how you can even feed a child on $3,000. Like, where do y'all live? And like in the middle of Nevada? I don't know. So every single study that's been shown on giving money to working families and just people in general has shown that they spend the money on normal things. Like people don't just go spend $3,600 in cigarettes. So that's number one. Number two, the Republicans technically support expanding the CTC. Oh my God, JD Vance said one time, $5,000 CTC. Wow. Well, that's really interesting because he's never voted to increase it. There's a reason why every single version of attempt to expand restore the ARPA CTC has failed. Romney's American Care Act, who he has moderated the CTC multiple times, added in work requirements, doesn't make it as expansive, doesn't make it fully refundable. This guy won't vote for it. There was a vote. He literally said, like, after 2 days after he promised to expand the CTC, there was a vote on expanding the CTC, and he missed it. So, like they're not going to.
Stop! I didn't vote against. Stop. Democrat lies yet again. Oh, saying he voted against. He was just busy. He was busy talking about immigrants. Okay, he didn't have time to solve child poverty.
Right. So, like, they're not going to do anything regarding that. And did we mention $6,000 for the first year? That's new. Yeah, $6,000 for the first year.
The newborn credit.
And yeah, that's obviously good because newborns are extra expensive. And it's, I think, cash benefits, y'all. I'm so happy this is getting popular. Now, do we mind moving on to other parts of the plan? Because I have like 15 bullet points here.
Let's move on.
Okay, this is a bad one. Provide a $25,000 tax credit for first-time home buyers over 4 years.
Based. I like it.
Subsidized demand, baby.
Well, like, hold on. I don't know. The reason why I think, Noah Smith, he wrote an article about this, and I pretty much, I don't know how anybody could really disagree with it. Essentially, Noah Smith's article, his main point was that, look, this isn't actually going to result in a huge increase in the price of homes. And part of it is because not everyone's eligible for it. It's not clear that you can just increase the price by aggregately $25,000 and sort of obtain this credit as a seller of a house. This is a policy that is probably net welfare inducing. However, obviously it is not optimal housing policy, but what it is, Micah, we had this whole segment where you talked about, yeah, if I was in charge, we would change the policy, but political calculus, this is probably a policy that plays very well to the average person who's never even heard of the phrase subsidizing demand, right? So that's why I don't really take these things to be that big of a deal.
So I don't like. It's not like I'm pulling my hair out over it.
Yeah.
But what I would say is I think that Americans' views on like specific economic policies are very malleable, so long as it's not really extreme, doesn't require like huge tax hikes or reduce their choice dramatically or anything like that. And so I think that you could just choose a good policy. Like you don't have to choose a bad policy. Maybe you omit some good policies because they might be unpopular, but like I don't feel like there's an excuse to choose a bad policy. Why is this a bad policy? Well, first, because supply is constrained. So this will have an upward pressure on prices. It's not any sort of demand side subsidy. Second of all, and people don't acknowledge this enough, home buyers are much richer than like a lot of the population. Right? What about renters? What about homeless people? Right?
This was my complaint.
We don't need middle class welfare in this country. Also, what about people who already bought their home but they have a huge mortgage? Right? Like it's just now new first time home buyers. What if I'm a renter in the middle of like New York City and I'm paying $4,000 a month and I'm making $800,000 a year. Now I'm a first time home buyer. Is there like an income cutoff for me? If there is, then that's another distortionary cutoff. So like,
I agree with all these criticisms. Just to be clear, I agree with all these criticisms. I'm just saying, you'll see like neolibs on Twitter that are just like, this is the worst thing ever, and it's like, guys, this probably just like doesn't even have that big of an impact. Like, I don't.
No, it doesn't.
I will take a centrist thing here. I'm convinced that part of what happens is because Kamala has a fairly small number of bad policies, all the people who are like in the know on what policies are just like completely stupid are like, we figured out these are like the 5 bad policies. Like the neolibs don't like price gouging. They don't like the like $25,000 back. And then there's like a third one that we're probably going to get to in a minute. They know all 3, but I think that what happens is conversely for Trump, there's like 50 bad policies. And
every policy is bad.
Yeah, like I don't know. There's maybe like 1 or 2 good ones he has in his entire thing out of like 100 or something, right? And it'll be something like, I don't know, simplifying the tax code. Okay, great, good job. So it's just, right. I'm convinced part of what happens rhetorically is that the neolibs are like, we figured out the 2 bad Kamala policies, and then there's the 100, no one bothers talking about them.
Right. What's the next thing, Micah?
Okay, so yeah, that's kind of cringe. Then we have one that's like normal and fine. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act cut the top income tax rate from 39.6% to 37%. She's going to bring it back to 39.6%. That's fine. State and local taxes, if you like look at California's highest tax bracket, which is like 14.4%. Then you look at payroll taxes, which, maxed out $125,000. Above that, it's only like 3%. This combines, it gives you a combined tax rate of like 56 or 57%. For people in the top tax bracket in California. The reason why I talk about in California is we just have to think about there's like a certain threshold in which your tax rates are so high that you're losing money or it's like causing a lot of people to stop working. But Micah, this is not, this doesn't need to be dangerously high anywhere.
Why should federal, I've heard people use this argument. It always seems like such a bad argument to me.
Argument.
No, I've heard you and other people use this argument as well. But my response to this is, why should federal policy be constrained by bad state policy? Like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Think about the consequences of our policies. I don't know, because I'm like, I care about the consequences of my policies, dude.
If you think the optimal tax, like for me, like I would say that like, well, we talked about it in the How High Could Taxes Go episode. I think I said that you could have 50% marginal tax rates. I think that was kind of the the level that I talked about, and maybe you could have, if you like you said, if you add in your payroll taxes and your consumption taxes, maybe you get to 70%. But if in my view, it's like, okay, well, we can get to you said 60%, so I don't think we're that far apart in our optimal tax policy.
10 points.
But anyway, so if that's what you think, I don't think California's tax policy is good. And to the extent that I think optimal federal tax policy is X, Y, and Z rates, I don't see why I should basically subsidize the bad decision-making of California politicians. Like, that seems like a bad framework.
Well, I think if you're going to include in your piece of legislation that you're going to cap state tax rates to make it work federally, that'd be super cool. And you might say, Michael, that's completely unrealistic and unconstitutional. I don't know. I'm not in law school yet. But what I can tell you is Canada has done something like this with their sales tax. They federalized their sales tax system and capped, I believe, the amount of extra sales tax they can charge on top. I think that's like super smart, and I totally love that idea for income taxes, corporate taxes.
The UK does the same thing. I just you wouldn't be able to. Probably it would be unconstitutional to do that, but I mean, I would agree. I just think that would be very weird. Like, it would be very weird to because you could ultimately get so granular. Like what about the people of New York City pay a certain personal income tax rate? And it's like, well, yeah, but like, what the fuck? Like, they live in a bullshit ass city.
I think you just look at the consequences of your behavior, okay? And if the consequences in the real world are going to be bad, then don't do it. If they're going to be good, then you can do it.
Listen,
now, only Vermont is
Look,
charging the higher tax rate.
as a
Go
Texan,
ahead.
I just don't care what happens in California. Okay,
So
who
big.
gives a shit? All right, we
Big.
don't have an income tax
Big.
here because we're based. All right, fuck it, just do whatever you want, Kamala. Anyway,
Based.
all right, well, what's the next thing?
Make the Affordable Care Act tax credit enhancements permanent. Okay, for y'all who do not know, if you are lower income, like up to like lower middle class, and you are buying your own insurance on the individual marketplace, okay, you're buying Obamacare health insurance on your state level exchange, you're not having employer provided insurance, you're not on Medicaid, there is a subsidy which caps your premiums, your monthly payments, at a certain percentage of your income. And this is subsidized. One of the big things that Biden-Harris did, which most people don't recognize, is these subsidies were actually going to expire. And they expanded them temporarily because I guess that's how everything works in this gosh dang country. So she wants to make them permanent. And if this doesn't happen, if like Trump comes into office and these are not expanded, so many people will lose healthcare. Millions and millions and millions of people will lose their insurance because they won't be able to afford it anymore. So this is like a sleeper policy that's actually very important for people to keep their healthcare.
Is it actually that many people? I feel like the number of people that get their insurance from the exchange is like 3% of people. 11%? Is that high?
Yeah, here, let's check.
I don't know. I thought it was because I read a report that was like, oh, you know, of all the people who newly got insurance after Obamacare was passed, like 90+% of them, it was just because of Medicaid expansion. They didn't actually use the exchanges, but I don't know. Maybe there's some different numbers that I'm not familiar with. What have you been able to find, Micah? I mean, it's
okay.
not just to be clear. Yeah,
go ahead.
Just to be clear, it's still not a good thing for these subsidies to expire because there is some margin of people that'll be negatively impacted. But millions sounds like a lot to me. What would you?
I think it's like well over 10 million people that are on the individual marketplaces right now. And I think like there might be family plans. So like it's certainly a pretty small part of the health insurance market, but something we should keep in mind is we hate employer provided insurance. Okay. Everybody in the audience right now, if your employer provides you insurance, we don't want your employer to provide insurance. Okay. STL is going to come and he's going to take your insurance from you. Okay.
That's right, brother.
We're going to raise taxes on your health insurance. Like goodbye businesses. Screw you, Chamber of Commerce. So we want to build on the parts of our healthcare system that work. That's either Medicare or that's the state exchanges. There's a lot of reasons why. Go watch me and Econo Boy's like 15 trillion hour video on healthcare, or go read my blogs if you want to understand why.
Well, so just Econo Boy on the note, I think you're right. You may be recalling there's Matt Brunig post on this, which was I believe from 2019, which showed that most of the increase in people who got coverage after Obamacare came from Medicare, Medicaid type expansions. However, since Biden entered office, there was actually a substantial rise in the number of people who got open enrollment ACA plans from about, it looks like maybe 11 million to 21 million people. So it's like a recent change that I don't know has been like seeped into policy discourse is all.
Interesting.
So it's 18.2 million people are in the individual insurance marketplace as of 2023 quarter one. And it's
this one's 2024. So look at it. It's 21.4.
Okay, great. And like a few million of them are on the non-marketplace insurance, which is like super weird that still exists. But it's a lot of people. Yep. A lot of people. My mom got health insurance that way.
Oh no, SDL, your camera turned off and on. What's next, Micah?
Okay. So guys, we have some business tax cuts. Okay, we're really going on the Reagan arc. Raise the startup business deduction, which allows people to deduct expenses in the first year their business starts from $5,000 to $50,000. So that basically means if you make under $50,000 in your first year of your business, bam, you're good. Like under $50,000 of profits. If you lose tons of money in that first year, you can actually carry forward this deduction. So you don't pay any taxes until you finally made over $50,000 of profit in totality over all of your years as a business. But it's only in your first, like you only get this one time. It's not like every single business is exempt in the first $50,000 of profits every year. No, that's not the case.
Yep. Generally in favor. I mean, you know, we're not really huge fans of we're huge fans of taxing the rich on this show, not huge fans of just taxing corporations, right? So anything like that probably is better than what we had before.
So
Well, I would just bring up an additional fact. There's been an enormous reduction since the 80s of the number of firms operating and entering into U.S. marketplaces. So like we have seen a rising concentration of firms. I think we talked about this on the last episode. And so if you want to incentivize market entry, you want to make it cheaper to enter. You want to make these losses easier. So this is a good policy in general. It should promote competition.
Right. Because originally when I saw this, I was like, oh crap, something cringe, because I thought it was like a $50,000 standard deduction for all businesses. And I'm like, okay, that's extremely regressive and really weird. Right. It's like, what if I'm a billionaire and I just own like a bunch of really small businesses, but I'm like super rich, like, and I'm getting this $50,000 deduction on each one? That's super strange. But since it's just in the first year, it practically is a subsidy for business capital. It makes it easier for them to invest in stuff, which investments are great. Also, more market competition. There's probably positive externalities to this in terms of innovation. And lastly, just think about starting a business. Okay, I started a basketball training business in my freshman and sophomore year. Listen, we won the Little League championship. There is administrative complexity to filing your taxes. Okay, even if it's past their taxation. So allowing just saying, hey, first year, first couple of years, you didn't make that much profit. IRS is not going to come after you. That is a nice weight off your back.
One thing I'll just add here is the Kamala campaign specifically cites a study claiming that the average startup cost is around $40,000 for these new businesses. So it's why they're setting it like $50,000 or so. So it's explicitly to try and make those like initial investments pay. Like you don't have to worry about that nearly as much. So I don't know. This seems like a fairly rational, like pro competition policy to me.
Based. I agree. Increase the low-income housing tax credit. So you see a lot of people in the YIMBY space, right? We want to make everybody happy. We say we need to build more housing, deregulation, and we also need more affordable housing. What is affordable housing? That's housing that is subsidized by the government. The government gives subsidies to developers for building housing, and in exchange, the developer signs a contract which says they're going to lease that housing out at a rate that is significantly below the market rate. The low-income housing tax credit is one of the biggest programs. I think it's over $10 billion of yearly spending that does that. It pays for, I believe, like 6 or 8% of the building's cost with a tax credit. It's kind of complicated. The government gives them this tax credit if they meet all the qualifications. Then they usually sell the tax credit to a financial entity, which gives them money for it. The problem is there's a lot of fraud, and the administration is complicated. The administration is complicated because the whole way the tax credit is bestowed, the whole contract process costs a lot of money. That increased the cost of construction. The fraud problem is the government says we're going to pay 8% of your expenses. Wait a minute. So if you have more expenses, that means you get more money, right? So there's been a lot of cases where they've documented fraudulent charges for affordable housing developments. And because it's government funded, there's also political constraints which are introduced where there is more resistance to these projects. I speak from experience. I've gone to a lot of Houston Housing Authority meetings where we've seen affordable housing projects absolutely like obliterated by like special interest group NIMBYs who are really upset about them, and they have more leverage because it's a government subsidized project versus a fully private project. And so because of these reasons, in a study which says that these projects tend to actually cost something like 10% more than normal housing projects, which is like more than the cost of the subsidy, perhaps. I'm not a huge fan of this program. I think the money would be better directed to other more cost-effective programs like housing vouchers or maybe a negative income tax or something like that. What do you think, STL?
Yeah, I mean, we've raised some of these concerns before. I haven't been able to look too deep into the LHTC administration, so I can't speak to that directly. I guess more broadly, the concern that I would raise for this, the concern we raised for the $25,000 credit is that it might just raise the demand for housing. And if the problem with our country is that we're not supplying enough housing, like if the problem is not that there's insufficient demand, but there's insufficient supply, then this is at least aimed at the supply side. So even if it's like, oh, it's 10% more expensive or whatever, maybe we just take that. Like maybe it's still a social positive because of the externalities of that housing and so on. It might be one of those things where it's an inefficient program. It could be much better if it was reformed, but like it's still net better than the alternative not doing it, just because housing and homelessness are so bad, right?
I just feel like the amount of pent up investment for housing is like maximally high, and it's just all supply constraints, which is like thwarting it. And so like subsidizing the demand even more, because this is really a demand. I mean, even you know economics, you're doing a master's in economics. It is a subsidy on the supply side, but it's really like the same as subsidizing the demand side practically. Now, here's something I would say. The way that you could actually subsidize the supply side in a way that might be different than subsidizing the demand side is if you subsidized loans. So if you provide increased access to capital, specifically for development in like low-income communities to prevent displacement and improve the quality of housing, that's the kind of thing that I think would make a lot of sense politically and actually could have supply impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only question that I would have is in places that have, for example, upzoned, have we seen that sort of soar in of new investment, or has LAHTC been sort of like a top off on that? That's sort of the question that I haven't been able to find solid answers to, if that makes any sense. Like, in other words, you might be right that there's like the surge of investment. It might also just be that like something, I know it's something that's been raised is that it may be harder to build new housing nowadays since Trump, because we have a lower undocumented immigrant population, and they were often the people who were working in that field. So we basically had like a sudden labor shock to one sector of the economy. And so maybe there are like other supply constraints. And so, like, I don't know, that feels kind of fucked up in its own way, right? Like, we should have an immigration system that allows people to come in here and get housing jobs and not be randomly kicked out by when Neo-Hitler 2 comes in, right? Like, that'd be bad. But just, there might be other supply constraints that are not just stuff like zoning, you know?
Right. I mean, I mentioned housing choice vouchers, and just to explain what that is, housing choice vouchers basically cap your rent at a certain percentage of your income. It's something like 25% for very low income people. And so it's like an NIT basically, but it's just specifically for housing. It goes to your landlord and it phases out as you earn more income. It is a decent program, but the problem is it's only like 25% of people who apply for it and are eligible for it actually get it because it's not adequately funded.
Well, and this is the argument that the same that we raised for the EITC of just making these universal or close to universal, and then just let it all sort itself out in the tax system, pretty much, right?
Right. The big problem with housing choice vouchers is they try to find landlords that are approved, which is strange because the landlords can reject the voucher, and also like there might be two different units which really cost different amounts, but like the government is charging the same rent to people for both, so there's horizontal inequities. It's the same problem with this LIHTC program. Like, okay, great, we're helping some people get affordable housing, but like there's a lot of low-income people which are not getting it, right? And it's like that's inequitable. So it's not the worst. What I would say is I think affordable housing subsidies actually make sense from a political economy perspective. We really worry about low-income and historic communities who have really like low-quality housing. And whenever they're developed, you know, like YIMBYs come in, we're developing stuff. They're not developing the kind of housing those people can afford. Now, you know, fully econ brain would be like, oh, well, that's utility maximizing, right? Like that is not going to politically work ever, right? So like if there's going to be development, it has to be affordable. And if it's not affordable, people will fight it and there will be no development. So I think that it actually makes sense to have subsidized credit from like HUD to develop affordable housing targeted to low income communities so that we can upgrade their housing stock without displacing the local population.
I know one question that I had, that this is sort of directly on the questions around whether LIHTC is efficient, is I know that a lot of costs in the American context can come down to like single family houses tend to be cheaper for a lot of reasons, like regulatory reasons as well, than like apartment buildings. So I just wondered, like, is some of it that does LIHTC tend to benefit larger constructions, which unfortunately seem to have a lot of reasons that they end up more expensive here that versus like in Europe, for example?
Yeah, I think LIHTC is all apartments. From my understanding.
Well, then that's sort of what I wondered is like, is it more expensive because of we have all these weird things which make apartments like we have all these stair requirements for apartments that just don't seem to matter for single family housing.
I'm sure that doesn't help, but I think they look at LIHTC funded projects and then they compare it to just normal apartments. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I think it's like a math program. It's like it's not the end of the world. It's not like we're throwing money into like fire. Like it's not like the first time home buyer subsidy because this actually is progressive, but it's like, can we do better, guys? Can we have a little bit more imagination? What do you think, O'Connell boy?
Yeah, I don't really have a super strong view on the like low income housing tax credit. I generally, me personally, I generally favor for low income people specifically. I generally favor basically just really expansive public housing. I think that's probably probabilistically speaking, your best bet, even in a market that's perfectly optimal, very little zoning, requirements and lane value taxes and all that stuff. There's probably, almost necessarily the case. There's probably still going to be some portion of people in these major metropolitan areas that struggle to obtain affordable housing because they're just low income people. And so you're probably going to need non-market housing to help those people to some significant degree. Of course, you could always just, subsidize them and, hey, in a perfectly regulated market, here's just $1,500 a month or something that you could spend on housing. You could do that. But politically speaking, like Micah said, there's probably, what's more realistic, right? We're going to have a perfect market and perfect universal cash benefits, or we're going to have an imperfect market where maybe the government puts more money into public housing. Like part of Kamala's plan is to liberalize zoning. That helps build public housing as well. Ultimately, you can do all these things in conjunction. But yeah, I would hope that part of liberalizing zoning hopefully would be expanding public housing and mixed income public housing, especially so that those poorest people in these metropolitan areas have some non-market options available to them. And the Singapore system seems to work pretty, decently.
On that note, Micah, would you argue that the LAHTC would be dispreferable compared to a public housing? Like you've argued that there's sort of all these complexities in administering this system, that there's like a lot of financial intermediaries, there's like the weirdness of the tax system. Would it literally just make more sense to run like a social housing program with the same budget?
I think the social housing program would avoid some of those administrative complexities. Maybe. I mean, if it's federally funded and it's locally developed, then actually probably has the same requirements that you have to jump through. And you just have to keep in mind, the more public involvement, the more pressure that NIMBYs have. And I've seen this. We do have public housing developments in the city of Houston. And there's like, when you look at corruption scandals in the city of Houston, it's literally always because of a random ass public housing project that nobody's even heard about. Like, there's always like, oh, actually, there was a coal mine here like 100 years ago. Oh my God, I can't believe the mayor wanted to put this place here. Oh my God, the mayor hired his best friend to be the law firm that administrates like getting the subsidy from HUD or whatever. So like, I just get worried about that. And here's something I want to say really quickly before I forget.
Just before we get off that, isn't that argument for like a TVA for housing? Like just make it a federal agency, just run it like that, or like an SOE, like USPS?
I think if you completely change the administration, then you could say, well, like, if your goal is trying to minimize displacement, and we're going to do this political economy based argument of like trying to build more affordable housing that's specifically subsidized in those neighborhoods, that can make sense. I generally prefer to subsidize working class people over subsidizing the supply side. And it's largely just because of a competition point. Look at current existing affordable housing projects. Let's say it worked perfectly, right? Let's say there was no waste, let's say all that was administered perfectly. There's still a problem of lock-in. So let's say I'm a working class person. I get a unit in a subsidized building in like a historic neighborhood, right? It is cheaper than all of the apartment buildings around. But because it's cheaper artificially because of the subsidy, and the subsidy does not move with me if I go to another place, they can treat me poorly. And that's what we see all the time. If it's a private company, they don't care. They don't care. If it's a nonprofit, you think nonprofits care about you? If it's run by the government, usually some sort of politician's friend is running this operation. There is not a competitive pressure to force them to do a good job. So ideally, the subsidy moves with you, and now there's a threat of you leaving.
So that's sort of what I was asking is like, is the solution surely not just like social housing aimed towards low income people with like some maximum income requirements, as opposed to most like apartments have like minimum income requirements, but like just run it as more or less a market which is segmented to the lower portion of the population. Like surely. I mean,
that's my understanding of how Singapore works. And of course, look, I'm not. Singapore is a city state. There's reasons why. Of course, you can't necessarily always apply, these very small countries examples to larger countries. But like STL said, the idea that you could have a TVA, but for basically housing development, and that you could essentially have a public landlord with mixed income public housing in major metropolitan areas seems like it would make sense to me. Like, for instance, you could almost like hybridize the Japanese model and the Singaporean model, where in Japan they sort of have like major metropolitan areas submit their zoning plans to the federal government, and the federal government in Japan, or the national government, whatever you'd call it, would either approve or disapprove those plans based on whether they thought that it was actually optimal for building more housing. So they centralized zoning in Japan, which is why they can build so much more housing, central democratic control of zoning. And so you could take that system and also organize a network structure of public housing development where, hey, we organize this major metropolitan areas. That's kind of where we operate in. Mixed incomes housing. If your income comes above a certain period, then obviously your rents are either going to raise, which means more money going to the federal government, or you're going to be forced into non-market housing. Hey, in 6 months you have to move out into market housing because your income goes above a certain level, or you just end up having to pay more in costs. And so all these systems hopefully work together. That's why I'm saying like a key part of my support for public housing development is liberalization of zoning. It just doesn't make sense if you're the city of San Francisco. Why would you even give a shit about pouring money into public housing? It's never going to get built. It's going to get built to a fraction of the degree that you actually spend money on because it's so impossible to build anything. So it's very, very important. If you're a socialist and you believe in socialized housing, you have to liberalize zoning as well. Like these things are very important.
Housing abundance will do way more to reduce rents and make housing more affordable and build the more walkable, livable communities that we want than any sort of subsidy. A subsidy is something you can argue for just based on like much smaller concerns that you want more housing security for specific groups. Frankly, if you ask me what I think the most elegant solution is, the one that has like the least chance of going wrong, we have an NIT or we have a UBI. And what we say is if you're homeless, you don't get your UBI, the government's going to take that and spend it on like giving you housing. And like I think it's, if you're not using your UBI, which should be sufficiently sized on getting yourself housing, it's probably because you have some sort of mental health issue or you're having some sort of substance abuse problem. And so we will take the money, we will make sure you have housing, and we will make sure you have access to psychological care and the like. Not only does this make a lot of sense and protect us from misuse of UBI funds and solve homelessness, but it also just makes sense as a federal program because look, all cities have to do is show, hey, I've proven that this person does not have a residence, and the federal government says, okay, we're going to start sending their UBI check to you now instead of to them. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think that it would be perfectly equitable. It's much more equitable than subsidizing any specific group's rents.
I definitely think I disagree with this, but we got to move on, Micah. What's your next thing on your list?
Stock buyback tax hike from 1% to 4%.
We'll talk about that in the next section predominantly. So I'll just say, to save for the next section, which is the audience topic, I'll say I don't feel very strongly about this. That's all I'll say.
It sucks.
Micah says it sucks, SDL.
Like maybe small positive effects. It's negligible either way.
We've run the gambit on the spectrum. What's the next thing, Micah?
Raising the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. Econoboy's going to come out swinging. I hate this policy. No, I mean, like, I think it kind of sucks.
It does suck. I think that one thing to keep in mind, part of the Biden tax policy, and this is not really a good thing, but it does make the calculus of a decision like to raise the corporate tax a little bit more complicated. So part of the Biden tax policy, the CHIPS Act, the IRA, is to subsidize, you could say socially optimal things with tax credits, right? And so what that effectively means is if you're a corporation with a high tax obligation, you will pay less in taxes if you invest in certain things. The IRA says if you invest in carbon neutral energy, we will give you a tax credit. The CHIPS Act says if you invest in chips manufacturing, we will give you a tax credit basically on what you spend as a capex to invest in these things. If you're a domestic manufacturer of key resources or things that we think are positive like solar panels, things like this, again, we'll give you a tax credit. So it's not that this is necessarily a good thing to raise the corporate tax. However, it does actually expand the capacity to invest in those tax credits sort of transitively. Because, for instance, if let's just say that you got rid of the corporate tax. Well, if you don't actually change your subsidy scheme, what that means is you're getting rid of all the subsidies that we give to renewable energy transitively. So you'd have to rethink that as well. So by increasing the corporate tax, you're probably having a marginally positive effect on investment in those areas. Probably not. it's hard to say if that's net good because the corporate tax, like the effects are bad, but they're not like that bad. So is the increased effect in investment on chips and science manufacturing and renewable energy investment, is that like net good? Maybe it is up to a certain point. It's not like you want to raise corporate taxes to 100% just because you can increase subsidies to renewable energy. But I don't know. It does the way that we do corporate taxes holistically does make something like that actually a little bit complicated. But overall, probably it's not great.
Yeah. So what I'll say on this is the corporate tax does not just tax corporate profits. It is a corporate income tax. And what does that mean? Well, it's different from a corporate profit tax in two ways. And economists call it a business cash flow tax, which is the optimal variant. First, it taxes investment. So you're not able to fully deduct all your investment in research and development and capital. And that's bad because when you tax something, you get less of it. So whenever you tax investment, you get less of it. You can partially deduct it over time, but it's not fully deductible, which is a problem. The second thing is whenever you make losses, you cannot always carry forward those losses at their present value in perpetuity, which means that suppose, this is very simplified, it's more complicated than this. You lose $100,000 one year, and then you make $100,000 the next year. You still might be liable for some tax. Now, because you can carry forward taxes somewhat, it's not perfectly the case, but there's instances in which businesses, which in the long run have earned no money, like no actual money over time, they've created no value, are paying taxes. And that's bad. Third, there's tons of avoidance. There's tons and tons of avoidance because the corporate tax is an origin-based tax, which means the way it's administered, it makes it really easy for companies to say, I'm actually an Irish business. We don't have any profits. All of our profits are being paid out to Apple Ireland to lease this patent, right? This is what happens all the time. It's called profit shifting. They're able to play the books to make sure they don't have any profits here. The higher our tax rate is, the worse those two distortions I mentioned are, which are economically harmful, and the more incentive there is for avoidance. So what we would say, I believe, is if we fix the structure of the tax to be efficient, raise it. Let's go 50%, baby. Tax the rich. Let's go. But as long as it's really inefficient, raising the tax rate actually might have all these economic and administrative harms that outweigh the positive of more revenue.
There we go. And I don't know, STL, if you have much more to add to that.
I mean, we talked about the corporate tax rate during the tax thing. I think that this is probably a bad move. It's probably, as Economy Boy says, less bad than sometimes indicated, but still pretty bad. And yes, there's better alternatives. So like, I don't know.
Also, I mean, one thing to also one thing that's
sorry.
I was going to say one thing that's always worth pointing out with corporate taxes is this just doesn't raise that much money. Like it doesn't even raise very much money to do cool things with, right? So that's always like the hard part for me when it comes to like even if you think the corporate tax is not a very distortionary tax, like these things are very overstated and it tends to tax shareholders and it's sort of a transitively progressive tax. Like, let's just say that that's all true. It doesn't even raise very much money. Like even really high corporate tax levels that are perfectly adhered to would not raise that much money. So, that's always something worth keeping in mind when we talk about the corporate tax. Is one of the reasons why I say it does more harm than good is it doesn't like provide that much revenue for socially valuable things, which in theory is what basically all tax revenue should go towards. So probably just just increase your capital gains tax rate or up your top marginal rate if you really think that's an important thing. So anyway, STL, what were you going to say? Okay, nothing else. Micah, what's your next thing on your list of 15?
So now we got to something you just mentioned, hiking the long-term capital gains tax rate to 33%. So that's a hike by about 5 points. Now it's labeled actually as a new net income tax rate of 5%, I believe, which is weird. Why do we have to make a new tax when it's really the same thing? I don't know why people do this. So I'm going to say, everybody already probably knows my opinion. I always think we have so many loopholes in our tax code. Right? For instance, billionaires are able to bequeath all of their assets without paying any capital gains to their heirs, and it's untaxed. That's tens of billions of dollars of money that we're losing, maybe over $100 billion of money. We have the carried interest loophole. We have itemized deductions. That costs us tens of billions of dollars. We have all of these exclusions from the payroll tax. We have a payroll tax which you stop paying it over $125,000. We should uncap that. So people pay the full payroll tax on all of their income, right? So we have all of these loopholes which benefit the rich. Why would we raise rates on the rich when we can just get rid of the special loopholes that they're benefiting from? Not only would that raise taxes on them, but it would end economic distortions in behavior that are caused by our current tax policies. That's the number one reason I'm not a huge fan of this. Number two, I agree with the majority of economists that when you tax savings, you get less savings. And when you have less savings, you have less investment. Now, I will acknowledge this is increasingly contentious because it depends on your theory of how savings and investment are related. And I have read the studies on this, and I will pull an SDL and I will say the studies disagree. So I don't know. But whenever I don't know, I go neoclassical, baby.
Oh my!
And I'm gonna assume that whenever people have less savings around, that means interest rates are going to be higher, and that means the cost of capital is going to be higher, which means less people are going to want to invest because it's going to be more expensive to get the capital to invest.
Yeah, I mean, I overall I think that this is probably a good policy. Just thinking of like sort of the net, sort of on net, is this a good policy? I don't think the capital gains tax is as distortionary as the corporate tax for a number of reasons that we've discussed before. This probably does more directly just tax wealthy shareholders. And so at that point, like what Micah said, I think that in this argument, you can concede, okay, well, there's probably some distortionary investment effects of taxing capital gains without allowing deductibility of investment. We've already said we all agree that you should be able to deduct your investments and just tax the consumption base. We all agree with that already. However, insofar as we are not doing that, then your argument sort of necessarily becomes one of utility. Okay, well, what has more utility? The marginal amount of private investment or the government using this money for social purpose and or just using it to pay down the deficit, right? So like what has more sort of long-term utility to the country? My assumption, probabilistically, also this has an impact on inequality. Inequality is bad, and then these have downstream effects as well. There's some marginal impact there as well. On net, I would say probably raising your capital gains tax up to a certain amount probably makes some sense. One of the reasons why this probably isn't as distortionary is because it's still taxing capital gains at a lower rate than income. So there's still sort of you could call that a subsidy to investment on net as well still. So, I just don't think that this is quite as bad as some people are making it. To be fair, this isn't getting much play in the media, so it's not like most people are really focusing on this. But I think on net's probably a good thing. SDL, any thoughts on the capital gains being raised?
I mean, just in broader arguments around like Laffer curve type stuff and questions of like effect on savings, like I generally take the view that most corporate investment comes from retained profits. And so like that's actually more of an argument around the corporate tax rate, if anything, than like these types of taxes around like savings and so on. So like I don't mind this stuff quite as much because I think that we have enormous wealth and income inequality in this country. This would slightly reduce that. We also do have like Micah is usually a huge proponent of noting that we have an enormous deficit. These kinds of taxes, like on basically the income of like the very, very rich and the income of just people in general, are useful in closing that. They can raise a lot of money. They're not super distortionary as far as I can tell. So like insofar as the deficit is bad, says Micah, and it's going to lead to all these long-term consequences, I don't know, I'll take this as one of those things closing the deficit because we think there's all these spending programs that do seem to have really positive investment returns. Like if I have to raise this to pay for children getting a 15-to-1 investment return, let's do it. Even if this is distortionary like a little bit, it's way less than the positive social externalities than some of the investments that Kamala is trying to do, that Biden already invested in. So that's sort of the logic, right? Even if it is distortionary, it's probably less so in the positive direction than the programs we're investing in terms of positive externalities.
Right. And I think that's a plausible argument. I mean, it doesn't raise very much revenue, but if you just take this money and you lower the deficit, I've seen arguments that raising the capital gains rate to reduce the deficit is pro-growth because the deficit is anti-growth. There's like a lot of harmful impacts. Increasing public savings at the expense of private savings, especially if it's not decreasing private savings that much, is not that big of a deal. Now, there's also the lock-in effect, which I believe exists. The higher the tax rate is on your capital gains rate, the more people are going to be encouraged to hold on to the assets they have and not sell, because whenever you sell, that's a taxable event. and therefore you have less money to invest in something else. So you're not comparing, $10,000 in Amazon versus $10,000 in Google. You're comparing $10,000 in Amazon, which currently you have, versus however much money you would have after you got taxed for selling your Amazon stock to switch to Google. That leads to allocative distortions. Ultimately, we all agree.
Can I add one relevant note here? Harris, I don't believe, included the unrealized capital gains tax in this proposal. Am I wrong? Did I miss it somewhere? Or
so I think she took it out, which is good because I thought it was a really bad idea.
So I just thought it was interesting because like the argument you're giving of lock-in, well, presumably even if she did actually like this tax, which to be clear, I'm not a huge fan of the unrealized capital gains tax, she would just say, oh, I'm avoiding all the lock-in problems because I've got this unrealized capital gains tax. Guess you better get out of the business of holding it, right?
Well, it's supposed to solve that problem, and it's supposed to also solve people deferring and not, paying their taxes through loans. I think it just causes more problems. So I agree, it does solve that problem. It just causes more problems than it solves.
Yeah. I mean, just to be clear on like the arguments that I think we would probably offer on more efficient ways to try and avoid lock-in. One is just avoiding the step-up basis in death, that when you die, you will be taxed. In fact, having a large inheritance tax might actually be like an anti-lock-in policy in that world, right? That either you spend it now, you invest it now, and you can't take it when you go. So be it. I think that might be a more amenable solution for some of these things. And I know that more broadly, you've raised arguments that I think that DBCFT type taxes tend to have anti-lock-in effects, but that's a little beyond the current conversation.
Super base. The one thing I will say is I did write a blog post on how the capital gains tax is a double tax. Econoboy mentioned earlier that we sort of subsidize savings by having a low rate on capital gains, but we actually tax income at the front end. So that's the reason why we don't actually subsidize it. Like if I make $100 today and I pay a 20% income tax on it, I have $80. And a neutral tax would treat me the same if I consume today or if I invest for tomorrow. But since we have the capital gains tax, if I invest for tomorrow, I get taxed again. If I spend today, I don't get taxed again. Well, I have to pay the sales tax, right? But I have to pay the sales tax later, whenever, even if I save for the future, I still have to pay the sales tax. So there's this extra layer of taxation which exists only if you save, which is a tax penalty, which can be distortionary. That's the neoclassical argument. Anyway, let's go to a bad idea, like actively bad idea. Eliminate tax on tips for service and hospitality workers.
So I am glad that it only has service and hospitality, because at least that, like the nightmare scenario that we sort of painted, I think on this show, I think we talked about this on this show, was like, what if your doctor is like, hey, if you want to be seen like without an hour wait next time, make sure you drop a 20 in like the tip bowl on your way out or whatever, right? Like there's plenty of ways that other sectors could extract tips that are voluntary. Well, but at least sectorally restricting it's like a step in the right direction.
Like this is obviously. We've talked about this before on the show. Like, obviously, this is dumb because number one, tipping is dumb. Tipping just shouldn't be a thing. Number one,
so true.
Like, we shouldn't be tipping people. We should just have a broad-based minimum wage and unionization, and these are the better ways to actually ensure that people get paid, reasonably equitably. That's just strictly better. Now, insofar as you don't want to tax poor people. Fair enough. Number one, poor people pay almost no income tax currently. Our current tax system barely taxes, if at all, poor people. Poor people just don't pay a lot of income tax, number one. In part, that's because one of the good things that Trump did with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that was the Trump tax cuts, he greatly expanded the standard deduction. The standard deduction, for those that don't know, it's a deduction in your amount of taxable income. That's how tax deductions work. They're not like tax credits. Tax credits reduce your tax liability after your bill is finally decided. Tax deductions reduce your taxable income. So if your standard deduction that you qualify for is, let's say, $20,000, basically what that means is that if you make $20,000 or less, you pay a 0% tax rate already on that money. Right, and that's current policy. I think the standard deduction, I want to say it's $12,000 for singles, $24,000 for married filed jointly, and that's not including all the tax credits you get and all that stuff. So look, if you're somebody out there that says, hey, I think that poor people should pay less in tax, totally agree. Take that little standard deduction thing, just increase it. Just increase it to $25,000. Just increase it to $30,000. Like whatever the number is, it makes way more sense to do that then like Micah's probably going to talk about, have another one of these little exceptions in our tax code that causes a little bit of distortion, that complicates things a little bit more, that allows probably some portion of rich people to get out of paying their fair share of taxes. It just like doesn't make as much sense as just raising the standard deduction or providing a tax credit or whatever. Anyway, Micah, what were you going to say?
Well, it's just like, it's so interesting that every politician just seems to wake up every morning and be like, man, I wish there was a way to cut taxes for like low income people. I have an idea. Like, dude, we have 1 trillion billion ways to do this. Like, everybody's already done this before. We need to simplify the tax code, increase the standard deduction, cut tax rates for like the working class brackets, or better yet, increase the EITC by more. Like, I think most of these tax changes, that they propose to subsidize people, just make the thing that you're already planning on doing bigger. Make the CTC $6,000. Like, F it, we ball, okay? Make your EITC maximum amount for everybody. How about that? Same amount for people that have 4 kids. Okay, we're not going to give that same amount to people with 1 kid. How about people with 0 kids? Go ham, okay? We don't need 1 billion trillion programs.
Yeah. All right. Any other things, Mike, on your list before we get to the audience topic?
The last thing I'll say is, I really care about institutions, and I talk about institutional reform a lot. And I think it's part of the reason why is because it's political incentives that produce bad policies. The reason why no tax on tips is a thing is because it probably actually is more of a vote winner than other policies, because it makes more sense to do a targeted benefit to a specific group of the population with like a big benefit to them than to do a small diffuse benefit to everyone. And so that's why we see all these special deductions, credits, loopholes given to specific groups to win over a union here or a business there or a specific cohort of the population, because there's a political incentive. It's the vote maximizing policy. And the way that you fix that is you can impose internal rules that prevent Congress, legislative making bodies from being able to have such, what I'd say, prejudicial policies that discriminate and give special favors and benefits to special groups.
Yeah, and we had a policy, we had a talk on our UBI episode where we talked about these tax expenditures, which is essentially the sum of all these tax deductions that exist, and it's just a ton of stuff of what Micah said, like very like politically infeasible things to get rid of. But it just policy-wise just makes sense. Like, for instance, there's a ton of veterans tax deductions. Like, veterans aren't taxed on like, the special benefits that they, like, if you're a veteran on disability, you get extra tax deductions for that. And it's like, it's just, I mean, it's not that it's terrible to do. It just like doesn't make as much sense. It's just saying, if you think that a veteran needs an extra, the tax deduction is worth $1,000, the effective tax rate's 20%. So you're basically saving $200 as a veteran with this tax deduction. If you think that veterans need an extra $200 a year, just give everyone an extra $200 a year. Like, it's not that much.
Just give all veterans,
or even just give the veterans a year. Like you're already paying. Like, you just give them through the Veterans Administration. Just give them the $200. Like, it's. This is the solution of universalism, right? Is always just give them the money, tax it back, like avoid all of the two-step things in the tax code.
Like, we probably trust. Yeah.
I think a great example is that we have, I believe in the state of Texas, special property tax breaks for veterans. And it's like, that is so weird, right? It's like, what if you're a veteran and a renter? Oh, screw you. Like, I'm sorry.
A homeless veteran.
No help for you, right? Like, it's not like the apartment gets a tax break now and like you get slightly low rents. You get nothing. What if you're homeless? Nothing, right? What if you own a huge home and you're a veteran? You get more of a benefit than other people. If you actually look at the distributional accounting in terms of dollars provided to families by these types of tax breaks, you would never support it if it was just a direct check. Oh yeah, we're going to cut $1,000 check to the guy in this big house, this veteran, and this poor disabled veteran in affordable housing, he gets nothing, right? But because it's a tax break, people think it makes sense. It doesn't make sense.
Micah, can I just, while we're on this topic of like, there are these narrow exceptions that often tend to benefit the rich. Something I've long wondered is, if Congress did have a sufficiently large research service, would this be the kind of thing where you could just be like, hey, go through each item in the code and see see the distributional benefits, see what this would cost if we were just paying people a check, like equivalize this to a check. What would this program look like? Because that would be extremely interesting to me.
I mean, you could do that, but like there have been similar studies on other major tax breaks. Like, for instance, the 401k tax break, saves
Super regressive.
it saves basically only the top 10% money on their taxes, and like no politician talks about getting rid of that. There's like no
It's
movement to
literally like $480 billion if you look at all these retirement tax breaks, 401ks, IRAs, like Roth and the traditional type.
Yep.
Or maybe it's like $280 billion. I don't know. Chat will, I'm sure that y'all fact check me and call me stupid.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, you want to save Social Security? Like, why is it always like, let's cut benefits for the poor? Like, why don't we cut subsidies to the savings of the rich? They're going to do the savings anyway. It adds more complexity to how investment accounts work. Like there's all this special tax planning that happens for it. You are literally just subsidizing the savings of the richest people in our society.
Like, it would make more sense. I think you could maybe advocate for like an Australian style system where it's like, hey, we're going to put whatever, $2,000 a year per adult into an investment account, and for every dollar that you put in, the government will match it up to $2,000 or $3,000 a year, or something like that. Like, you can maybe advocate for something like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's, like Micah said, it's just that I think what it requires is just frankly someone who's willing to spend the political capital to do it, like Obama with Obamacare, right? Where like that seemed to be clearly something that they knew broadly would be unpopular for at least a while. And they just took the hit in order to do it. And so major tax reform is probably the same thing. But it would also obviously be good.
I'm
yeah, it's a little bit
because we got tax simplification in the late 80s or early 90s. And it was a big thing. They're like, oh my God, we finally simplified the tax code. We've talked about this so many times throughout our history. Just like we've talked about, hey, let's reduce the deficit. We got a balanced budget like one time, and then it instantly went away. Why? Because political incentives create these problems. And I think
Uh-oh.
Hello? Big
Okay,
tax got me, okay? No, yeah. But like we need institutional changes. I think the tax fix is harder. Like you could put in place rules that prevent special privileges and breaks. I'm sure there's some way to do that. But like for deficits, you can put in place internal rules that limit deficits within specific contexts, right? And it's like, I think these rule changes are the way that you win the war and not just individual battles.
I think that we should
really
quick. I think that we should subsidize, every rich person has their own tax accountant that helps them avoid taxes. We should subsidize tax accountants for poor people so that they can learn how to avoid taxes just like the rich do.
So that's the only equitable solution. No, something that we discussed, I want to say in the liberalism v socialism discussion is, I think one suggestion that's been put forward is don't allow legislators to submit legislative law directly, but put forward like an idea and then you submit it to like a committee of experts, call it economists, call it lawyers, whatever, and they'll rewrite it into law, which might be able to avoid some of these special interest focused bills essentially. Now I know it won't completely get rid of it. You could easily just ask them to like write no taxes on tips into law, but that's been one of the arguments that like I think I want to say you and people in like the neolib sphere have offered.
Yeah, I think it's just institutional. Like there is some sort of institutional structural change that you can do to fix this. I think expecting politicians just to like one day have the courage and like be like, yeah, I'm not going to do all this stuff which benefits special interest groups to the disadvantage of society. Sorry, bro. Like I would have given my hopes up.
Well, anything else on your list, Micah? We probably should wrap up and get to the audience topic soon.
That's most of our tax plan. There's a bunch of random, really boring stuff about corporate tax accounting and specific like corporate tax allowance being expanded and this provision, that provision. Honestly, I don't understand any of it well enough for us to talk about it. So if there's something we missed, don't care. Sorry, Lib. Okay, leave it in the comments. We might pin it.
Can I? One thing that I got mad at. It's a very, very minor thing. If you turn to page 38. In the proposals, there is in fact one error. It's a graph error. They mislabeled the y-axis on one of their graphs. They just duplicated it from a previous graph, and it makes me so mad. The graph should be in percent, but it's labeled in thousands of units of housing. It's a graph of vacancies. So I'm just mad, okay? The intern, whatever intern, if you're watching this podcast, intern, you messed up. You slipped up, and you thought I wouldn't notice. But you're
Kamala's gonna lose because of this intern, dude. You just lost the election, bro.
The Pennsylvania election coming down to like 2 votes, and it's the 2 people who follow graph crimes on Twitter.
Yeah,
that's so true.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, there you go. That was Kamala's big brief that she released. And look, to the extent that you care about these policies and you think they would be good, go out and vote. Obviously, if literally there's even one extra Republican in any of the chambers of our government instead of Democrats, none of this stuff will get passed. 0% of these things will get passed. If there are 218 Republicans and 217 Democrats in the House, 0% of these things will get passed. If there are 51 senators that are Republicans and, Republican aligned independents, whoever it might be, and 49 Democrats, 0% of these things will be passed. So be sure to vote.
And if there's a Democratic trifecta, we're going to have like the no democracy ever bill, and it's going to pass. Okay, guys, I need you to understand the stakes. How about the everything ever is exempted from taxation, except for like working class people's normal payrolls? Okay, because that's Trump's tax plan. Do you want that? Do you want economists to kill themselves in mass? Vote.
Yeah.